Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Thank you all very much. And I just want to really thank all of the people who put in so much time and effort to make sure that GBF continues to function in the ways that it does and has for a number of years. And I am really grateful to everyone, the board and all of the volunteers. So thank you very much. And it's always a joy to be here. So as I was sort of thinking about the talk, for the last few months, I've been meeting with another group of clergy who from a variety of traditions, and it was very interesting because in these conversations, one of the other people who happens to be Christian said to me, you know, what do you think about X, Y, or Z in your in Buddhist faith? And it was very interesting because my first response was, that doesn't sound right to my ear, this idea of Buddhist faith. Because I have always been of the opinion that what we do is we have Buddhist practice. But then I started to think about and sort of investigate, well, is there such a thing as Buddhist faith? Do we believe in anything, right? And it sort of set me up in this really interesting sort of thing. Now, I have probably heard over my lifetime thousands of Dharma talks and read hundreds of books, and but none of that really made a difference in my life as much as sitting down, getting quiet, and asking myself questions. Is this really true? What happens when I do X, Y, or Z? Even my vows, right? Like when I ordain, we take 16 vows. 3 of them are the refuges, 3 of them are what's called the pure precepts, and then 10 that are called the grave precepts. And those, oftentimes the 10 precepts are often the sort of 5 or 8 or 10 that one would take if they were going on an extended retreat. But even those, right? Like in some ways, when we think about them, they're not even commandments. They're not rules. They're not even suggestions. They're just sort of, these are things that I use to orient myself in the world in particular kinds of ways. It's not something that is commanded upon me. And when I break them, which I do all the time because they're not really achievable, considering that one is to save all beings, I started, because they're not, like, a lot of people will call them vows, and I think that's a mistranslation. I think that they're not vows, they're precepts. And you know, a disciple of the Buddha does not kill. As I begin to practice with what that means, it's not so much about not killing, because there are so many ways in which no, I've never committed murder, but there are ways in which I've killed my own dreams, I've killed my own joy, I've killed other people's joy, I've killed other people's dreams, I've uh, you know killed flies and mosquitoes. And I remember shortly after I got ordained, I was sitting a retreat, and they had the windows open, and there was a mosquito that kept landing on me. And I really was struggling because I was like, I took this vow not to kill, and there's this mosquito, and it's itching me, and I'm going crazy. Um, and I went to my teacher, and he said, well, you can't really capture a mosquito, and you don't have to sit there and suffer. So what other options are there? And it was a really interesting thing, because he said that it's not about some rigid adherence to these precepts. It's about how do these precepts affect us in our life, and how do we live our life in such a way that it points us in a particular kind of direction. So, and then I thought about all of the different schools of Buddhism and the ways in which different schools of Buddhism might look at faith or look at the ideas of faith. And in a lot of the Pure Land schools, because they believe in so-called other power, although I don't necessarily think it's that rigid, something like Jodo Shinshu, they have an idea called Shinjin, which often gets translated into English as faith. But it's interesting to me because it's not faith that just sort of arrives. It's faith because of the practices that you do and because of the ways in which you look at your life. Shinjin gets cultivated. It's not, and it's a result of chanting and being compassionate in the world. Which then led me to think about what are the things in Zen that we have faith in, right? And anybody who's heard me speak will often hear me say that one of the sort of foundations of Zen is that we are already enlightened, that we already are Buddha. But is that a faith? Or is that something that for me, it's something that I figured out because I sat down and I began to look at all of the places in my life where I had those moments of enlightenment, where I had those moments of liberation. So it's not faith that was given to me, or even faith that I decided to have. It's faith that was cultivated. No matter how hard I try, I can't give anyone the belief in that experience. I can't give you the belief that we're all enlightened. Because it's not true simply because I say it's true. It's true in my life because it's based on my experience. It's based on looking at my life deeply and looking at the experiences of my life. And that's why we say you can't practice for anyone else. You can only practice for yourself. If we look at Theravadan Buddhism, from which the school of insight meditation grows, there's a practice of making offerings to the monks, and that the belief that generates merit for us. And a lot of people think that that's that belief in the generation of merit is something that just is given to us, and that's why we make offerings to the monks. But when you actually sit down and you talk to people who practice in that way, what you find out is that they make offerings to monks because they see the effects of that merit in their life as it is while they're doing it. They feel better. They feel more compassionate. They feel more at ease. They begin to let go of their own attachments to X, Y, or Z. And so it's a belief that was cultivated based on their experience of doing this activity. In Korean Zen, they often will cultivate what's called great doubt. And it's not sort of the doubt of like, oh, I doubt that's true, or, I doubt in the veracity of this person or whatever. This great doubt is to begin to question all of the things that we think of as true. So, Korean monks will often spend years just asking themselves, what am I doing? Who is doing this? Who am I? What am I? What's happening here? And years and years and years of every moment asking yourself that repeatedly begins to cultivate a doubt in the sort of epistemology and the solidity of this idea of that we hold about ourselves or anything else. So that then when we push through that, we begin to settle into some relationship to the flexibility of our life, the flexibility of our own mind, the flexibility of our own experience of the world. Even if we look back on what we know from the Buddhist teachings, from the Tripitaka or something, the Buddha never said, do this, or believe these things. Like he taught about the Four Noble Truths. That was the first teaching. And even there, when you read the sutta that was written down about that, you find out that what he said is sit down and examine your life and see if this is true. Look at the moments that you suffer and see if you can see why it is that you're suffering. See if it's true that you're suffering ultimately because of your attachments or your aversion. See if it's true that your life is riddled with moments of suffering. See if it's true that if you practice the Eightfold Path, that you begin to have less suffering. Does this bring around an end to suffering? And throughout the stories we hear about his teachings over the years that he taught, we see over and over again that his instructions are to do something different. It's not to believe something. And I think it's a really interesting, it says a lot about the difference of Buddhism in the world and the ways in which those of us who identify as Buddhists approach ideas of faith and belief. I don't necessarily think it's important for anyone to believe anything in Buddhism. There are people who identify as Buddhists who don't believe the Buddha actually existed as a human being. Does not believing that change fundamentally how it is that we practice? Not really. Or if they believe that the Buddha actually existed, they don't necessarily believe the hagiography, the story of the Buddha's birth, death, and life that has been passed on. They question the veracity of that. You know, in Zen, we have this long lineage of ancestors that are traceable back from me today all the way back to the Buddha. And there's a lot of questions about whether or not those people even existed, including Dogen, who is the founder of the school of Zen that I practice. Does that change fundamentally my practice? Not really. And the reason it doesn't is because my practice is based on my practice. It's based on what it is that I find out when I do the things that I do. What I see when I sit down and I look at my life, when I sit down and I look at how I orient myself in the world according to these 16 precepts, what happens when I do X, Y, or Z? Does that move me closer to moments of liberation, or does that move me further away from moments of liberation? You know, even ideas I think about myself. When I first started to practice, one of the questions I had was, if there's no self, then how can I be queer? And I've gone round and round with numerous teachers, and part of what has changed for me isn't that I identify as any less queer, but my relationship to my identity as a queer person has changed. What it means for me to be queer in the world today is different than it was when I was 20. And part of that's aging and living in a body that's not 20. But it's also just my understanding of the world and how the world works and our place in it as queer men. And I think that's what happens when we begin to allow ourselves to not be so sure. One of my favorite, and one of the reasons I actually started practicing Zen and really got curious about it was because I had started working with Zen Hospice Project, and on the wall was this quote that's attributed to Suzuki Roshi that says, you know, the secret to Zen is two words, not always so. And I thought that was hysterically funny, but I also thought it was really interesting. Like, what does it mean to live in a way that not always so is true? You know, the idea of questioning everything that I'm doing and asking, is this true? Is this real? Is this me? Is this taking me closer to enlightenment or taking me away from enlightenment? Whether it's chopping carrots or cleaning the toilet or taking a walk, is this real? to sit down on a cushion and allow myself to stop fighting myself, to sit down on a cushion and just allow the experience of me and to look into the nature of that experience, not the stories about that experience, but what's it like to be me in this moment. And I think that what that's allowed me to do is to really start to see the moments of enlightenment that exist in the world. It's allowed me to see Buddha in not just myself, but also Buddha in everyone else around me. Because I see the moments of enlightenment in their life, including the people I don't necessarily always agree with or like, or the people that I love from 300 feet away. The more I look at the nature of the experience that I'm experiencing, the less attached I become to the story of that experience, the more real, the closer I get to the real experience of that experience. And I practice that when I sit on the cushion, but then I also practice it when I'm at the bedside with somebody who's dying, or I practice it when I'm meeting with my friends. Like just the conversation that sort of started this inquiry for me, when somebody said the words Buddhist faith and it just didn't ring right in my ears. And my first response wasn't, oh, that's not real or that's not true. It was like, oh, why does that not ring true for you? Why does that sound weird to your ear? And then to begin to investigate whether or not my ideas about that line up with the nature of that experience in the moment that it happened. So I would ask you, what do you think about what's your experience of belief in Buddhism, of faith in Buddhism? I firmly believe that Buddhism is a religion and not just a philosophy, but I also believe that it's not a religion based on faith. It's based on experience. It's based on what we do. It's based on practice. Thank you for your attention. I thank you for your practice. I thank you for existing. And now I want to invite the shared wisdom of the room, because that's the other thing. Like I'm not even the smartest guy in this amalgamation of humans gathered together. So I'd like to hear your wisdom. And I don't know how the hybrid model works. I can see the small group of people that are there, and I'm really glad that you're there.
Well, we'll ask those who are in the Zoom world to unmute and ask a question if they care to do so, or if anyone in this room please just raise your hand.
I'll also say it's the hardest thing in the world to be the first one.
Not for me.
I love you, Chris. I love you so much.
I'll jump right in here. You know, the idea of faith has bounced around a lot in the Western Vipassana world. Sharon Salzberg wrote a book on faith about a decade ago. And so, you know, there was a lot of confusion with hope. And just, anyway, and it's part of a group of practices called the Indriyas. They're the 5 spiritual strengths or powers. It's faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. They're kind of like basic things we operate in. And I've always taken faith to be trust and practice, just what you're saying. It's like the more I do it, it confirms it works. And the way it works is my suffering has decreased. And I am assuming the suffering I've caused others has decreased, true. And you know, when I look back at started practice, I started in the early 90s with mindfulness-based meditation. In fact, I started coming to the Buddhist center there and taking classes there, and then realizing GBF was there, and then started going Sundays. So it kind of goes back to that time. And boy, was I suffering, as we all were. Our friends were dying. The relationships we were trying to develop would fall apart. We had no models. We were creating models in relationships, not only with coupling, but also in groups too, and losing those groups. And so the suffering that was and I was working in a trauma ICU as a nurse, and that was death and dying and all that kind of stuff, damage. So what I'm saying is I really, really, really was suffering. And the practice allowed me to give me space to learn to sit with that. When I first used to sit, I mean, I would churl and churn, and I was like in a straitjacket in my mind. I could barely sit for 5 minutes sometimes, or 10 minutes. And sitting with this group on Sundays and starting to learn how to practice really developed a lot of trust. And within that trust, it was faith. It creates this faith. It's not a hope, it's a true honesty with what the practice has done for me and how I engage with others. And just added this thing about merit and offering out food to the monks. That's established in cultures where, you know, there's a whole strong devotional group of Buddhists, and I don't really hang with that crowd. You know, I'm kind of like in the philosophy kind of group, right? And yet there's a whole group that don't sit at all, and just it's devotion. It's devotion to their elders and their family and to the communities and to the monks and the teachers who actually in those small communities they're their psychologists, they're their therapists, they help them to discover honesty and truth of their life. And I don't know what I'm talking about, but thanks for talking about this. It's a big topic for all of us, I imagine.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And you know how much I love you and appreciate you. So So I can speak a little bit more about the devotional practices and those people who practice that. And I've actually read a lot around that. And one of my friends, when I was in seminary, actually did their entire dissertation on that, on devotional practices in Theravadan Buddhism. And basically what he said is they don't meditate, but the meditation is the practice of devotion, is this offering of support and medicine to the monks. And you know, and then the seminary I went to was actually a Jodo Shinshu seminary, and so I spoke to tons of people who practice Jodo Shinshu. And again, they were still practicing. Like there is even though the devotion is a very big part of it, the devotion comes from a practice of sorts, right? Like they're chanting, or they're making offerings, or they're doing puja. They're cultivating in their own lives things like compassion and love and caring and generosity. And then I think about, there are people who do nothing but practice writing sutras or copying sutras. They just trace them. Again, I think that that they begin to see the fruits of that, so they keep doing it. And so it's not even sort of blind faith of like, oh, if I go here on Sunday, I'll feel good. It's more like, oh, if I notice when I do these things, my life gets easier.
I'm just going to say something about devotion. Oh, go ahead, Bob. I didn't mean to jump because I'll just start yakking away. Go for it, Bob.
Well, I'm hoping I can say what I have on my mind. I want to thank you for just bringing forth in me thoughts. The word faith always implies religion, and I don't particularly see Buddhism as a religion. There's a joke about, I forget who said it, tell people there's an invisible man in the sky who created everything, and most people will believe it. Tell people the paint is wet and they'll have to touch it. And for me, Buddhism is a set of statements by many people over many years. And I have the opportunity to check them all out for myself. I can tell the paint that they've put down on paper and see how it relates to myself and experience the truth of that. So I don't see Buddhism as a faith like the joke describes. I've said it many times, I consider it basically a handbook for living. You read it, you check it out, and if it works for you, great. So thank you for today.
Thank you.
Oops, no.
I was just going to say something to devotion. I come from a really devotional group. My mom and all her sisters and that. So they had like little altars in their kitchens with the little light and the Virgin Mary or something there. There was a power and intensity in those kitchens that is unlike. I'm glad I experienced this as a child because I could see their devotion. Whether they could discuss philosophies of religion or whatever, they were very devoted to their faith. I could see them. I watch my mother do a rosary or see that front row in the pews and people flipping their rosaries. There was an intensity that I can capture, and I think we all do, that sort of warmth we feel or intensity we can feel on just a love for other people or, being with a baby. There's an devotional quality that's separate. It's a humanistic thing. You see apes doing it when they hug. I don't know what I'm talking about. Thanks for listening.
Lee, would you like to speak?
Sure, thank you. So for me, first of all, Buddhism is distinctly not a religion. It's non-theistic, and at least in its overall structure, it's not hierarchical. And of course, Buddhism has many ideological branches, and some of them differ from that. But for me, Buddhism is, and actually I've thought about this a little bit, it's the science of its time. So back in the time of Buddha, we didn't have microscopes, we couldn't take things apart, we didn't have telescopes and all that sort of thing. So how did you find out about the nature of existence? And of course, as humans, the most important question for us was, for me, for what feels like me. And so rather than looking externally, it came through introspection, looking inside, what's going on inside this me-ness. inside what we would now call commonly the mind. And so that's how I think it came, first of all. And I'm not aware of what we have of our sayings of the Buddha, though, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, of Buddha ever saying you should have faith. Believe in me, just take what I say and follow it. And the Dalai Lama once, when asked, what if science disagrees, has findings that contradict those of Buddhism, he then said, Buddhism has to change. And so those are the perspectives that I have of it. And it's not a faith, and the purpose of Buddhism, as I understand it from Buddha and most of the branches, was ending or at least decreasing suffering. And that was the way of finding it. And the Dalai Lama, whom I take as one great teacher, also said at some point, what is your religion? And the Dalai Lama, as I understand it, replied, my only religion is kindness. And so those are my perspectives on it. And it doesn't agree with all of the various ideologies of Buddhism. So, and I guess that's really all.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of that. Samuel.
Hi, it's Samuel actually, but
Oh, okay. I'm very sorry, Samuel.
who would know? Well, I just want to. I appreciate your focus on the practice, because that is my experience as well. That it's fun, that the practice is fundamental to get beyond the thinking mind, which is really that of the personality that keeps us small and in our story. And my own personal experience, I grew up in a very Catholic family, but one of the things that was quite profound for me as a kid was there was a particular ritual called benediction, in which there would be singing and incense, and it was very much the movement into, it was a ritual space into this transcendent experience of that was, of another realm that for me is the realm of spirit, or of this mystery of life that infuses us all. And as a kid, I was raised on a farm, and I kind of, I recall, I didn't understand it at that time in this way, but I'd be out in the pasture, bringing back the cows. We had a few cows to milk, and and I would just be, there would be the clouds and the crickets and the grasshoppers and the breeze, and it was just like, and I would be singing, and I just felt like that moved me into this non-dual reality. But also in my current practice, I'm more of my major practice is the diamond approach, which is a little different than Buddhism, but there's lots of parallels. But it's actually the felt experience of presence, that there is this support of reality that's here, that's beyond the personality, that moves me into another space, and that is such a key part. And I'm not that familiar. Like Tara Brach talks a lot about presence in the way that seems similar to as I know it in the diamond approach. But it's all about the practice, because you can read about it, but it's the felt experience that takes us into, beyond our smallness, that I think is fundamental.
Thank you very much. Richard.
And thank you, Samuel, also for bringing up the felt experience. I think that spirit is a very important part of my experience.
Richard, we can't hear you. Could you
I'm
speak?
sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Thank you for your talk, and thank you, Samuel, for bringing up the felt experience of the spirit. I think that that's a very important part for me. My teacher has always taught me that when I am struggling and having trouble with with issues in my life to turn to the practice, to turn to the tools that I have and the practices that I have to connect, to reconnect, to ground, to reconnect to the spirit within. And it strikes me, I grew up Roman Catholic, but I had problems with the dogma of the church, but I did very much feel that I wanted to follow the teachings of Jesus. So still consider myself Christian in that sense. Buddhism for me has been a series of practices rather than a religion. But faith in the practice is something my teacher, current teachers, certainly taught me many times. It struck me that I remember a passage that reportedly Jesus said, "Not all those who call me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the things I do, practice what I teach." So thank you again for your talk.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. It's hard for me to see the in-person crew. Is there? I see that, Lee. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anybody
Absolutely.
in the room that's actually present.
No one here, so we're good. So go
Okay,
ahead,
great.
Lee.
Okay, well, so I just wanted to add something fairly briefly to what I said before, another piece of it, and that doesn't seem to be discussed much in the Buddhist groups and teachers that I've heard, though it is sometimes. And that's the concept, but it's important because I think because it relates to science again, and that's the difference between relative and ultimate reality. And so as I understand it, relative reality is, it's me, it's the picture behind me, it's the group there, and it is pain and suffering. And ultimate reality is the oneness of all and the non-existence of a separate self. So if it isn't there, in ultimate terms, there's nothing really suffering. And that is the perspective that I have, and I've read enough recently, though I'm by no means competent in it, in modern physics and modern astrophysics, to know that that's very consistent with the views 2,500 years later that the other approach to science has also generally arrived at, that it's all one ultimate connection, even including, as I understand it, which isn't very clear, time. And for anyone who wants to think more about it, though not particularly around those issues, I recommend Philip Moffitt, who's one of the principal teachers and on the governing council of Spirit Rock, initial and I still think fundamental book called Dancing with Life, Buddhist Insights for Finding Meaning and Joy in the Face of Suffering. And and I admit, I'm an academic. It is, in a sense, an academic book. It takes one through the Noble Truths one by one, the insights that you get through them, and putting them together about how to leave one's life. And it is focused on decreasing suffering. So that was what I wanted to add.
Yeah, and I'll respond a little bit. The important piece about the two truths, which is a very important teaching, and I wrote my thesis on it and spent a lot of time reading about it. And the important piece that often gets overlooked is that they arise simultaneously, that they both exist together, and neither one is bigger or more important than the other, because if we focus only on the ultimate, we lose, we're going to be led astray. And if we only focus on the relative, we're going to be led astray. And so it's very important when we're looking at these things to really understand that they are, and Nagarjuna doesn't even say it's the two sides of one coin. They arise simultaneously. So, Tom, I see your hand.
Sorry. Okay. So just real quick, belief and faith. That when you said faith, I thought, well, that involves beliefs. And I think beliefs are important. I think it's important to know what beliefs you have, know what you believe in. And, and I think meditating can help you figure that out. Like my sister belongs to AA. And so she believes in addiction. You know, she believes in the reality of addiction. And I find that I don't, that it's not a real thing for me. I feel like I don't feel like I'm forced. Anyway, I don't believe in addiction, she does. And I think there's a lot of things in our lives that we do believe in and sometimes we don't. But all I really want to say is that meditation helps me figure out what I'm believing and what I'm not believing. And that's it. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that a lot. Anyone in the in-person area?
No one here has raised their hand, and I think we have time for another comment or question.
Great. Chris?
I really grok with the mind training aspect of Buddhism and the philosophical. It's been what really has brought me to it and understand it, and the sciences behind it, and all that's being discovered now with neuroscientists that meditate and stuff. And yet, Buddhism across the world, I think only like 15 to 18% of Buddhists meditate, and a large percentage are devotional. I mean, you look and they've got their gods and goddesses and realms, and who am I to say that that's not a religion to them? It is their religion, it's their culture and their life. And one thing that's criticized a lot about modern Western Buddhists is that we just cherry pick the philosophical aspects of the practice, and we sort of identify as Buddhists. I'm not even sure if I'm a Buddhist. Identifies as for Buddhists, and yet it's become rather insulting to the traditional crowds that have been Buddhists for centuries. I just want to offer that out. Also, Philip actually identifies as also a shaman. Lee brought up Philip, and so Philip, yeah, that's you brought up. Yeah, he actually identifies himself also as a shaman. So go figure that one out. I don't know where that comes from, but anyway, thank you. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for bringing a real juicy topic up. Thanks so much, Daigan.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your kind attention and for your practice and for your wisdom. And I appreciate all of it, and really grateful whenever I get to sit down in the company of other queer people, so who are practicing and trying to do their best.